What is the military significance of these crimes against humanity, crimes against civilians? Why are the Russians doing it? What do they gain from it? And what are the possible consequences for the conflict itself?
Well, she's spot on about what's happening. The atrocities, certainly war crimes, they began from the earliest days of the invasion when Russia was illegally bombing civilian infrastructure, and it's continued since then. And we know of the specific atrocities have occurred, and just the ravaging of the civilian population and the infrastructure in Ukraine. There will be accountability one day, and people will need to be held responsible. And it's going to be an important part of this history that's written right now.
One of the things that's happening right now is a battle for Bakhmut, that city in eastern Ukraine. It looked like, in fact, the Ukrainians were going to have to withdraw. Right now, as best I can tell, they're not. There's one line in to supply. Give us a sense of what the significance of this battle for Bakhmut is.
Yeah, I don't think there's much strategic or operational significance with regard to how it would affect the war, but clearly it has political significance for both Russia and for Ukraine. Russia has yet to take a major city, if you will, in months. They lost Kherson, I think, in the fall, which was one. And for Ukraine, they want to hold on to their territory. They want to show defiance with regard to Russia. It bolsters them with the West. And so you'll see this continue. My concern, though, is you have Ukraine fighting Russian warfare, attrition-style warfare. Experts predict that for every one Ukrainian soldier that dies, seven Russians die. But that's the game that Russia is willing to play, and I don't think Ukraine should take that bait. We'll see how much longer they can hold out. But if I were Ukraine, I would be thinking about how do I marshal my forces, my resources, and really prepare for a counteroffensive that could puncture that eastern front and then really drive the Russians out of eastern and southern Ukraine.
Well, as a military matter, which you understand so well, can the Ukrainians win a war of attrition? Because that doesn't seem to be, from all accounts, what Russia's doing. They're just throwing more and more men into this, even though they're getting, by many accounts, slaughtered.
Yeah, I think the odds are against them. Look, Russia's 4 times their size, has 4 times the manpower. And so I don't think that's how they're going to win. They're going to have to win by adopting Western-style maneuver warfare, which is more akin to what we saw in World War II. That's why providing them mechanized armored vehicles and tanks and F-16s or other fighter aircraft are so critical, because if they have those tools, then they can go on the offensive, break this stalemate along the front that looks very static right now, and really push the Russians out. The Russians can't fight that type of warfare. At least we haven't seen them do that yet.
What about those tanks? We talked about it so much, particularly the Leopard 2s, because we understand the M1 Abrams are going to take a while to get there. But where does that stand? I read over the weekend that maybe there's a little bit of disagreement between Poland and Germany, where Poland was basically being critical of Germany for, as they thought, sort of dragging their feet.
Yeah, a lot of historic rivalry between those capitals, of course. But there are tanks trickling in, Leopards. Ukrainians are being trained. But to conduct the size of an operation the Ukrainians would need to conduct it to lead a counteroffensive, you're talking about needing battalions of tanks, and now you start getting into the dozens of numbers. So I'm concerned we won't see the type of counteroffensive that we need to see for a few more months. And my aim, if I were the Ukrainians, would be to do that before the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, in July. That gives them some time. But on the other hand, we know that the Russians are still training and organizing those conscripts they recruited last fall. And at some point, they're going to dump them onto the battlefield as well in large numbers and try and conduct their own offensive.
You mentioned earlier, Mr. Secretary, the F-16s, and there were reports over the weekend that, in fact, there may be some early sort of trying out of some Ukrainian pilots to see how much would be required to get them dressed up on the F-16, get them trained fully. What do you make of that? Are we almost inevitably going to give them F-16s sooner or later?
You know, it's like Charlie Brown in the football once again. The White House says no, 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 and then we start seeing that argument fall apart. The president said his commanders don't recommend F-16s, but yet we know in Munich that the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, an American general, said that the Ukrainians definitely need F-16s. So I think it's inevitable they'll either get F-16s or a Western European aircraft, but they do need fixed-wing aircraft to dominate the skies, to suppress the enemy air defenses, and eventually be able to conduct ground strikes as part of a counteroffensive.
There's another big player or potential player in all this. That, of course, is China. We saw Chancellor Scholz meet with President Biden at the White House last week. And one of those topics was very much China and what role it will play, whether it'll stay on the sidelines, whether it'll come in on Russia's behalf. Give us your sense of where China is right now and how critical its position is.
Yeah, I think Schultz visited the White House for three reasons. First of all, to make sure he's aligned with President Biden on the war. Secondly, he wanted to talk about the domestic subsidies that were contained in that Inflation Reduction Act. But third, I suspect it was getting aligned on China. We have evidence or indications that China is considering providing lethal aid to Russia. We know they've been providing Russia all types of other aid, technology, buying their energy. And I think he wanted to make sure that both countries were on board in terms of what would happen if we discover China providing lethal aid. You know, keep in mind, Germany's the fourth largest economy in the world, but China, the second largest economy, is their number one trading partner. So the Germans get a little skittish when we start talking about sanctions against China. And I think that's a big part of what was going on there.
Mr. Secretary, help me on this because I used to think I knew what lethal aid was. It was guns, it was missiles, it was tanks. That's lethal aid. But in this new high-tech world, it appears that microchips are lethal aid. Can we really effectively police the question of whether China may be providing forms of technological expertise, equipment to the Russians?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, David. I mean, we do know we classify lethal aid as things that can do harm, like you said, tanks and missiles and guns and things like that. But look, anything that enables Russia, enables the enemy, the aggressor here, to conduct war against Ukraine, in my view, is providing them lethal assistance. And in so many cases, too, China has provided, like you pointed out, semiconductors, but in some cases, dual use items, drones, for example, that can be used in the commercial sector, but can also be used on the battlefield to conduct surveillance. So I think this is a really fine line we're drawing. I think we should really push back more strongly about all the assistance that China is providing Russia and get the Western allies on board again with this call.
Well, absolutely right. And it's China's assistance to Russia. But even beyond that, in U.S. relations with China going forward in trade, we now are seeing reports that perhaps, for example, President Biden might issue an executive order saying that U.S. citizens cannot invest in some of that dual-use technology over in China because China can use it in any potential conflict with the United States down the road.
Yeah, this has been going on for decades, David. I used to work export controls for dual use items, and the Chinese are very good at getting around all of our control mechanisms, and they've used it effectively to bolster their space industry, their defense industry, their own tech advantages that they've now used against us. So I think tightening these things up are very important, particularly in strategic areas. I've written about this even recently. We need to see greater strategic independence for us, and that's going to require some decoupling in key areas between the United States and the Chinese economies.